Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, we lost a local icon this year, Century 3 Mall, or we started to. Demolition began earlier this year, and it has been a long time coming. The mall had been in decline for years. It closed its last shop in 2020, but it was also just a really important spot for a whole generation of Pittsburghers. So, in loving memory of this West Mifflin treasure, we are dubbing this one our most nostalgic story of 2024 and sharing with you our conversation with a local mall expert before we knew for sure that the building would in fact be demolished. We're talking about what made it so unique, why people were so drawn to it over the years, plus our hopes, at least back then, for what could maybe come next. It's Monday, December 30th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Matthew Newton, welcome to CityCast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, Megan.
You literally wrote the book on shopping malls some years ago. It's actually on my bookshelf downstairs. It's a really beautiful little book called Shopping Mall. I know you studied all kinds of spots all over the country, but Century 3 was part of your childhood. What was it like to learn that it had been condemned?
Yeah, I mean, it's always bittersweet because in the book I get into a lot of like my, I sort of have a love-hate relationship with malls. Of course, it's more, the older I get, the more it's a love
It's
relation.
loving criticism.
Yeah, I think the love sort of like grows as I get older because, of course, as they fall, one by one, it seems like. But yeah, Century 3 Mall, definitely the news of it being condemned was definitely like, I mean, everybody knew it was going to happen, but it's like, I don't think we knew that, like all the terrible things with like arson and all these different things that have happened in the mall. So it's definitely a little bittersweet,
Well, I mean, it felt like there was going to be some hope. Moonbeam Capital, this company based out of Vegas, bought it in 2013 with all these promises to fix it up. And it turns out they've done that dozens of times all over the country from what I read. It seems like they really let them fall to pieces like Century 3.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I'd heard the name Moonbeam for, off and on for years, probably originally when they bought the malls they were first on my radar. But yeah, I think they have about almost a dozen malls across the country. So it seems to mostly be East Coast and Midwest, but they have a history, it seems, of either, not paying taxes or promising big developments when they, buying a mall like a Century 3 and promising like this rejuvenation effort and then, leaving their properties just unfortunately to kind of to languish until they get to the point like Century 3 where, there's water pouring in the ceiling and, it's essentially beyond repair. And
have you been inside Century 3 lately?
I have not actually. It's one of those things I've wanted to do, and I actually have my 17-year-old son Ethan was like, "That would be pretty cool," and I was like, "Yeah." Like the dad instinct had to kick in. I was like, "We probably shouldn't go in there." And also, admittedly, I've heard some crazy stories about it just from people want to share their mall stories with me, and none of this is like reported, of course, but it's just things that people have told me, which I think have become this sort of weird like local myth making. Like,
no, I love normal gossip. Keep going.
Yeah, and there's like supposedly there's people like people were like living in there'd be like people like kind of camping out there overnight, and there would be people like there was a friend's son actually told me this story. He heard of someone walking around there and like basically, I don't know if they were using like a BB gun or a shotgun, but just shooting storefront windows. And
I mean, something happened to some of those windows because I've seen the photos of the glass everywhere.
Yeah. And like, so I don't know exactly like, but it's funny because it all becomes this sort of like urban legend, like kind of that sort of, like this sort of just gossip, that you don't know like what's true and what's not.
It seems like it's becoming sort of a pilgrimage spot for folks that like to see old relics like this. I mean, from my perspective, it seems like maybe that's part of the problem. Like a bunch of YouTubers were charged with criminal trespassing.
Yeah.
You mentioned arson. There was that fire in April. And then a high school student from West Mifflin fell through the roof while filming a TikTok in June. Luckily, he's okay, but he fractured his back and punctured his lung. Like, these are not small injuries.
Yeah, when I heard about that, I was sort of like, oh my God. Like of course, once again, like just as a human, but also as a parent, it's like, you don't want to hear about people falling, 2 stories inside of a dead mall. I mean, that's not ideal, but my goodness. I mean, I think the other thing that sort of sticks out to me too is that I think definitely it became like a pilgrimage site for like urban explorers and folks who consider themselves like kind of YouTube personalities. But I also think what's interesting about that is like some of those folks are super meticulous in their prep for those sorts of things. And they have like, they know about the idea of like, structural integrity being, like compromised. And they actually consider that. And then other folks going in there not considering it. Like this recent group that you said, like how I think they were all charged, right? With, and so.
Yeah, which I think is the first example I've seen. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but, of this recent cropping of folks trying to go in there, like there's always relics in Pittsburgh and people kind of crawl around them slowly, carefully, but I guess these got caught.
Yeah, no, I actually thought that too when it happened. I kind of got the sense with this latest group that they just thought, oh, this is totally fine because obviously it's all over YouTube. And then,
well, and people were doing it with permission. It was the set for some movies. There were some interesting artist residencies there where folks were just kind of creating in the space. I was never clear on whether all of that was happening with full permission, but I mean, I assume at least the film sets, for example, had to have been. The insurance needed it.
Yeah, the artist collectives that were working in there, that was when the mall was still open, and they definitely had permission. I actually think they paid rent. They might have actually paid rent to like rent a storefront for a while.
Wow, okay. Yeah. And then there were some holdouts too. That comic book store was there forever.
Oh yeah, you got to give a shout out to New Dimension for because that store was incredible. I mean, I'm also a comic book nerd, so like I really appreciate that store. But
I'm not a comic book nerd, and I still appreciated that store. It was so good at what it did.
Yeah, and what's funny is that location that that was that store that used to be in Century 3 relocated to the waterfront, and
Right.
I overhear conversations still like when I'm at that location of people saying like, oh, why'd you guys why did you leave the mall when you did? And basically they were just like, we were like one of the last people to leave, we're like one of the last stores to leave. So like they said, but it was no heat in winter, no air conditioning in summer, like for the last, I don't know, it was like 3 or 4 years. So it is interesting that
all of us have had bad landlords, but I think maybe they take the cake.
Yeah, I think Moonbeam was not paying all their bills, I guess, or something, So it's.
This is an ad from BetterHelp. This holiday season, do something for a special person in your life. You. Give yourself the gift of better mental health. BetterHelp Online Therapy connects you with a qualified therapist via phone, video, or live chat. It's convenient and affordable and can be done from the comfort of your own home. Having someone to talk to is truly a gift, especially during the holidays. Visit BetterHelp.com to learn more and save 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
Well, so take us back to the mall's early days. What was it like when it originally opened in its heyday?
Yeah, well, it's a super Pittsburgh story, which pretty much
we love those.
Well, yeah, right. And as many stories in Pittsburgh, at any sort of real estate development, it starts with being the site of a former site that U.S. Steel owned. U.S. Steel actually had its own realty division, which I recently found out whenever I was kind of like looking back at some things, and it's like they actually owned the site. And they were looking to do something with it. And it was actually a slag heap, which is just like the cast off from, working with iron ore and basically like, making steel and iron. And
I didn't realize it was as old as it was. I was reading about it. 1979 was originally when it was built and opened.
Yeah, it opened in 1979. I believe U.S. Steel, like about a decade earlier is when they started. Basically, the slag heap was actually called Brown's Dump, which I'm not exactly sure why. But And it was about 200 feet tall, from what I understand. And it was almost like a little mini slag mountain, I guess. And literally train cars used to pull up to it and pour slag onto it. And it would be, supposedly at night, it sort of had like a glow when that happened.
Oh my gosh.
So it went from that to being flattened for, it took several years, I guess, for them to sort of really like get the site prepared. But yeah, 1976 construction started for Century 3, and then it opened in 1979. So it's actually not like in that first wave of malls by any stretch. It's definitely when malls were already becoming like a huge deal, like all across the country. But
well, and I know from your book that, a lot of malls had like some kind of special kitschy thing that they like hung their hat on, something that was exciting about this location versus that one. What was Century 3's thing?
Well, I actually always thought Century 3 meant that they had 3 levels, which they do have 3 levels, but the third level was, well, not, when it was in its heyday. The third level when you went in was like literally like it was only like 2 stores, and then you just went down escalators. But turns out, just reading about it again recently, it was around the time of the bicentennial, like 1976. It actually C3 stands for like just the third century of the United States, which,
It does?
That's what it's like.
I guarantee you most of Pittsburgh has no idea that was supposed to be the connection point.
I think it's a really bad branding situation, because I don't think anybody would make that connection. So, but otherwise, yeah, it was developed by the Edward J. D. Bartolo Corporation, who actually had, several malls across the country, but they really... Century 3 was a pretty big undertaking at the time, because I believe when it opened, it was like the third largest mall in the world.
Wow.
But I feel like that was like a selling feature for any time a mall opened, because it's like 1.2 million square feet or so, like when it opened.
That's what I read too.
Yeah. So and that's, there's now been probably, dozens of malls bigger, because you have, of course, like the American Dream Mall, New Jersey, you have these, Mall of America. But yeah, so it was a pretty big deal. And especially, over that way, all those folks were looking at a slag heap for many years. So you figure they were, and from what I understand, like in the run up to them leveling the space and actually putting the mall in, that's when a lot of those businesses along 51 started to kind of pop up.
Yeah. Well, in your heyday for it would have been like the mid to late 80s, early 90s?
Yeah, I definitely bought my first pair of Vans there,
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, like, what was the vibe? Like, what was the fun thing to do?
Yeah, I was going to say that was the thing. It was sort of like, that was like the heyday of like, everybody walking around in their little sort of like social groups, you had like sort of like your gearhead folks, you had your jocks, it was like it was like a larger microcosm, I guess, of like of high school, in the area. And of course you had adults and everything there, but that's not what you were worried about when you were, like a teenager, people following their crushes or whatever. It was like the usual weird mall situation, but it just felt so exotic,
Hey, I think it's one of those weird, like shared experiences so many American teenagers have of a certain era, right? Like,
right.
It was the place to be, or it was the place you kind of wanted to be, or like, stuff would happen over there. And if you weren't there, then like, oh my gosh. What do you think was the first sign then that Century 3 was going downhill, that, this maybe isn't going to last forever?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because, so Simon Property Group, who, is kind of like a fairly well-known like mall sort of company.
Yeah, I think they still have Ross Park Mall, don't
Ross
they?
Park Mall, which is actually a super good example of like a Simon property and what they normally do. Like they normally kind of start to bring in more upscale retail, like, kind of big national names like Nordstrom.
Yep, they've got
like,
Burberry and Louis Vuitton. Like they're doing fine.
Yeah, they're doing really great. Actually, it seems like it's like one of those malls where it's like, yeah, they've made it a pretty big destination. But Simon had it for a while, and it seemed like it was going to be okay in like those in the 2000s sort of, and then it seems like it was like once Simon sort of started to seem to lose interest, like in the mall, like I feel like they definitely seem like they understand malls, and they were always like doing, as a mall sort of company, were really, kind of on top of trends and things like that. And it's like almost like the death knell for a mall is often when you see independent businesses going in, which shouldn't be the way it is. It should be incredible that like the community actually is coming into the mall and being able to use it. But it's almost like always because the mall has such a vacancy rate that like they're lowering rents, and actually people like normal average, independent businesses can afford then to actually come into the mall. But then that's almost always the sign that like finances are bad, because they're having
that means the rent is low.
That means they've been dropping rent. That means they have high vacancy rates. So it's almost like goes back to the origins of the mall, whenever the malls were basically killing main streets in small towns. It's almost like, I don't know, there's some sort of like weird poetry in there. I don't know, or like but yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I guess as sort of a eulogy, maybe, we saw where someone on Reddit had asked people what they would like to see the mall become. Like, if money were no object at all and it were up to all of us, what could it be? 80 acres, 200 stores, 6 anchors, 1.2.5-ish million square feet. Can I read you a few of their ideas?
Oh, yeah. I'd like to hear it.
One of them was a lunar surface training center.
That'd be incredible.
A zombie-themed paintball arena / movie theater where you could watch Romero films.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
A reverse escape room where you have to break into the building.
That's pretty good.
A living human museum with the store-sized dioramas depicting a specific way of life.
Oh, my God. These are all pretty great. They don't sound like they're going to make a lot of money, though, so that probably wouldn't. But yeah.
I mean, let's just pause capitalism for a moment.
Yeah.
A Pittsburgh biodome where, let's see, we live off Turner's, Iron City's, Eaton Park Salad Buffet, indoor golf course included.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Affordable housing.
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah. And maybe probably what's most likely to happen, let nature reclaim it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's, I kind of love all of those, really. It'd be cool if Moonbeam would take anybody up on that, but
yeah, right. Well, I mean, I guess while we're dreaming, is there anything that you hope for the site of where Century 3 used to be? What would be your big dream?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't mind seeing it get reclaimed by nature, quite honestly. But I mean, obviously in a more productive way. I live in the East, and Churchill Valley Country Club has turned into a greenway now. Like, it was abandoned for years. It was an abandoned golf course, and it turned into a greenway that's actually kind of beautiful now. I wouldn't mind seeing something like that, where like you could have, maybe you keep like they did in Oakland. You keep like how they kept the back wall of Forbes Field intact. Keep a couple sort of foundational or structural pieces of the mall intact that are sort of and then start to almost like, not terraforming, but whatever you call that, like where they start to use the parking garages and things like that to start like green spaces, and I don't know, that would be kind of incredible. But
yeah, maybe we'll get the Parks Conservancy on the horn. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
Matthew Newton is a writer and editor who also works in art museum publishing. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I really appreciate it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. We first talked to Matthew all the way back in 2023, and demolition has since started. But a big update since then. Officials have since announced that the state is putting $1 million toward rehabilitation of the blank slab where the mall used to be. Something tells me it's not going to go toward a zombie-themed paintball arena, but hey, we can keep dreaming. We will be off the next couple of days for New Year's, but we'll be back on Thursday in 2025 with a brand new episode. Have a happy and safe New Year's, Yins. We'll talk to you then. If Century 3 does get demolished, what will Century 3 Chevrolet be minutes away from?
Yeah, I guess minutes from the crater.